At the Waldorf Astoria in New York, the ultra-wealthy CEO, Isabella Montgomery, faced a catastrophic dilemma. Her date for the year's most exclusive social event had just cancelled. Yielding to anger and pride, she decided to inflict widespread humiliation by choosing as her escort David Miller, the discreet janitor who had maintained her premises for 3 years. She considered him a mere uneducated pauper, a puppet at her disposal. What she didn't know was that this man with the stooped posture hid a past as a military intelligence colonel, was fluent in 5 languages, and had been preparing his revenge for his wife's death for 3 years. When the Russian ambassador greeted him at the gala, addressing him as Colonel Sterling, her edifice of certainty began to crumble, and Isabella realized, too late, that she had invited her own executioner to her last night as a free woman. The lights of the 30th floor of the Montgomery Tower twinkled on the black marble like fallen stars from the Parisian firmament. David Miller handled the mop with hypnotic motions, unchanged for 3 years, making the scuff marks of shoes worth more than his 6 months' salary disappear. The rhythm of his work was akin to a meditation, a screen of banality hiding much darker thoughts. It was 8 in the evening on a Friday in November that the capital would not soon forget. Rain lashed against the large windows with peculiar fury, turning the lights of the financial district into impressionist watercolor strokes. The building was almost deserted. Only the glow from Isabella Montgomery's office persisted at the top, like a beacon of inextinguishable ambition. David knew this office inside and out. He had spent 3 years analyzing her every move, every habit, every flaw. 3 years pretending to be invisible while recording passwords whispered on the phone, files carelessly left on her desk, and confidential interviews that Isabella thought she could hold without the janitor understanding English, German, or Russian. He could hear her shouting behind the armored glass walls. Isabella Montgomery's voice, when enraged, could cut a diamond. Tonight her fury had a specific cause. Robert Thompson, the industrialist who was supposed to escort her to the Red Cross gala, had just called to cancel. His wife had uncovered their affair, threatening divorce. The game was over. The gala started in 3 hours. It was the event of the year, where New York power was put on display, where alliances were made and broken between a flute of champagne and a facade of a smile. For Isabella, showing up alone would be like bleeding in a shark tank. Her rivals would judge her weakened, exposed, and vulnerable. David continued his cleaning, but every fiber of his being was strained to the extreme, like a violin string. He sensed that something was about to happen tonight. He felt it in the atmosphere, like animals sensing an imminent earthquake. 3 long years of patience were finally about to pay off. The office door swung open with such violence that the glass vibrated. Isabella Montgomery burst out, like a fury dressed in a black Chanel suit, a haute couture jewel worth $20,000 that molded a figure perfectly maintained by personal trainers, cosmetic surgeons, and a diet that would make a Tibetan monk falter. 39 years that looked like 30, platinum blonde hair styled in a chignon so strict it created a natural facelift effect, and gray eyes the color of weapon steel. She stopped in the middle of the corridor, her phone in one hand, a glass of Japanese whiskey, whose price exceeded David's weekly salary in the other. She set her gaze upon him. No, she didn't look at him. She assessed him the way one assesses an object, a piece of furniture, an instrument that is used before being discarded. David pretended to ignore her, focusing on the floor, which was already impeccably clean. It was a role he had been playing for 3 years. She feigned his non-existence. He feigned not truly existing. But tonight the play was ending. Isabella examined him with laser precision. 6 feet tall of muscle, concealed under a deliberately loose work shirt. Shoulders that hinted at years of military training, camouflaged by a worker's posture. Hands grasping the mop, but which, if she had looked more closely, would have revealed calluses misplaced for a simple janitor. Calluses formed by weapons, not by brooms. The idea sprouted in her mind like a malicious flash. It was an idea perfect in its cruelty, brilliant in its arrogance. She would go to the gala with the janitor. The message would be unequivocal. Isabella Montgomery was so superior, so unreachable, that she could afford to arrive with anyone on her arm and still reign over the assembly. Her competitors would be forced to interact with a janitor as if he were their peer, degrading themselves in the process. She advanced toward David, her steps cracking like detonations in the deserted corridor. He continued to clean, but he could smell her fragrant trail, a mix of Chanel No. 5 and the metallic scent of ambition. When she spoke, her voice was like poisoned honey. The proposition was both simple and demeaning. $3,000 for 3 hours of his presence. Put on a tuxedo, smile, nod, speak only when absolutely necessary, and slip away at midnight. For a janitor whose monthly salary was $1,400, the offer was impossible to refuse. David finally looked up. For 3 years he had taken care never to look her in the face, always maintaining a lowered, submissive, inoffensive demeanor. But at this precise moment, for a fraction of a second, Isabella perceived something that chilled her. It wasn't the gaze of a janitor, it was that of a predator who had patiently waited for its prey to fall into its trap. The moment was so brief that Isabella convinced herself she had imagined it. The stress, the whiskey, the anger at Robert. David had already dropped his gaze to the floor, murmuring a humble, "Yes, ma'am," that seemed straight out of a classic movie. An hour later, in the presidential suite of the Waldorf Astoria, the transformation took place. The team of stylists Isabella had urgently mobilized shaped David like sculptors working with marble. However, when he emerged from the dressing room, everyone realized they hadn't created anything. They had merely brought to light what had always been there. The custom-tailored tuxedo looked like it had been made for him. Every line, every seam, every proportion was impeccable, but it wasn't the garment that unsettled Isabella, it was the way David wore it. Not with the embarrassment of a disguised janitor, but with the ease of a man accustomed to wearing a tuxedo in embassies, official receptions, and dinners with generals and ministers. His hair, usually hidden by a worn cap, was cut with military precision, graying at the temples in a way that conferred distinction, not age. The beard, which Isabella had always seen poorly maintained, was closely shaved, revealing a resolute, almost noble jawline. But the coup de grace was delivered when David pulled a watch from his pocket, not the digital Casio he usually wore, but a classic white gold Breguet, $50,000 of French watchmaking that no janitor could ever afford, even by selling an organ. He fastened it to his wrist with the same casualness as putting on a simple bracelet. Then, among the shoes offered by the stylists, he did not select the most expensive but the most appropriate, a detail that only someone accustomed to this kind of event would have noted. Isabella perceived the first crack in her perfect plan. Who was this man, really? But pride overcame doubt. Her decision was made. She couldn't turn back now. The limousine drove them through a New York adorned for the holidays. The illuminated decorations turned Fifth Avenue into rivers of stars. The Empire State Building shone like a colossus of crystal and light. David sat calmly, hands folded on his knees, in a posture that betrayed military training to anyone who knew how to observe. During the ride, Isabella tried to probe him with seemingly innocuous questions. Where did he learn to clean so well? How long had he been doing this job? Did he have a family? David responded with courteous monosyllables, revealing nothing, preserving his secret. But as they passed the Russian embassy on East 91st Street, Isabella noticed a detail that froze her. David stiffened imperceptibly. His right hand sketched a movement of a few millimeters toward his left hip. The instinctive gesture of someone looking for a weapon that is no longer there. It lasted only an infinitesimal second, but Isabella saw it. The Metropolitan Opera House rose before them, like a Baroque jewel bathed in spotlights that made it look like a fairy tale setting. The red carpet formed a scarlet sea surrounded by photographers, journalists, and onlookers, contained by barriers and security guards. The elite of New York, the U.S., and Europe arrived in a ballet of limousines and sports cars. When their vehicle came to a stop, Isabella inhaled deeply. It was the moment of truth. Either she triumphed or she was destroyed. She took David's arm with a smile she had perfected over 20 years of heated board meetings. The janitor who wasn't one offered her his arm with the elegance of a dancer. They emerged from the car under a shower of flashes. Photographers chanted Isabella's name, inquiring about the identity of her escort. She smiled enigmatically, letting the mystery pique curiosity. They entered the opera house through the monumental entrance. The interior had been transformed into an Eden of crystal and gold. Baccarat chandeliers hung from the ceiling, rare orchids adorned every corner, and a string quartet performed Debussy with surgical precision. The New York elite turned as they passed. Isabella savored this moment of glory. She had caught them all off guard. No one expected to see her arrive with a stranger, much less a stranger who looked like a movie secret agent. But this triumph lasted only 47 seconds. Just enough time for the Russian ambassador, Dmitry Volkov, to cross the salon, ignore the crowd, and stop in front of David, his eyes wide as if he had seen a ghost. Ambassador Volkov was a man who had witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union, survived 3 assassination attempts, and navigated the perilous waters of Russian politics for 30 years. He was not one to be easily surprised. Yet facing David, he looked like a child who had seen Santa Claus. He spoke in fast, agitated Russian. David replied in the same language with perfect fluency. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to overturn everything. Volkov stepped away after shaking David's hand with military respect, murmuring a phrase that chilled Isabella, even though she didn't understand Russian. The domino effect was immediate. Other guests who had overheard the conversation began to approach. General Henderson, former Chief of Staff, greeted David warmly. The British military attaché shook his hand, calling him Colonel. The German consul raised his glass to his health. In less than 10 minutes, the janitor Isabella had brought to humiliate her rivals had become the center of attention, and it was not condescending attention, but sincere respect, almost a form of deference. During the opening waltz, as they danced beneath the frescoes, Isabella felt the ground give way beneath her Louboutins. David led her with an assurance that spoke of years of practice in embassy ballrooms. Every move was impeccable, every step mastered. It was then that he spoke to her in a low voice, without ever losing his smile for the cameras filming them. He recounted a story that almost made her stagger. 3 years earlier, Colonel David Sterling, of military intelligence, had lost his wife in a car accident. The vehicle had been hit by a stolen truck that was never found. His wife, 6 months pregnant, died instantly. Their little Emily miraculously survived. The investigation had been closed without charges. Someone very influential had made the evidence, the witnesses, absolutely everything disappear. David understood it was not an accident. His wife, an investigative journalist, was about to publish a report on counterfeit medications that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals was selling in Africa. 2,000 children dead in Mali because of diluted vaccines and adulterated antibiotics. Isabella continued to dance, but her body had stiffened like marble. She remembered that case. She remembered the order given to neutralize the journalist by all necessary means. She had never connected the deceased journalist to the janitor she hired 6 months later. After the gala, in Isabella's penthouse overlooking New York from her ivory tower, the truth exploded like a bomb. David was sitting at the $300,000 Steinway piano, playing Satie with a virtuosity that belied 3 years of lies. His fingers ran across the keyboard, narrating a story of pain and revenge that needed no words. Isabella had placed a pistol and a hard drive on the crystal table. The choice seemed simple: eliminate the threat or surrender. But David had been playing a game of chess while she was playing checkers. From his phone, he showed her a safety net he had woven in 3 years. Copies of the evidence disseminated worldwide, a dead man's switch system that would release everything if anything happened to him. His daughter Emily, safe in a secret location. The negotiation lasted until dawn. No screams or threats, just the cold logic of 2 predators aware they were at an impasse. David wanted justice, not vengeance. Isabella wanted to survive, not necessarily win. The final agreement was recorded and transmitted live to a lawyer in Geneva. Isabella agreed to cooperate with the justice system, confess everything, and accept her sentence. In return, the Montgomery Empire would be transformed, not annihilated. The 30,000 employees would keep their jobs. Hospitals in Mali would actually be built. The Monday following the gala, New York woke up to news that shook the towers of the financial district. Isabella Montgomery had presented herself to the district attorney's office at 6 in the morning, flanked by 3 lawyers and 20 suitcases of documents. It was not a surrender, but a skillfully orchestrated earthquake. The courthouse on Foley Square became the epicenter of a judicial tremor that would shake the U.S. for months. Magistrates, accustomed to extracting confessions with forceps, found themselves facing a CEO who poured out her crimes like a raging river. Names, dates, bank account numbers, recordings. Each document was a bomb that brought down a section of the European pharmaceutical industry. The operation was named Clean Meds, and within 24 hours it had already generated 30 arrest warrants. Executives handcuffed in front of cameras, villas seized by the Financial Crimes Unit, accounts in Switzerland frozen. The US had not seen such a cleanup since the savings and loan crisis. But the real spectacle was playing out within the Montgomery Tower. David continued to show up every morning at 6, dressed in his work shirt, with his cleaning cart and his cap firmly on his head. Employees stared at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. Everyone now knew who he really was, the ghost colonel who had brought down the Queen. Yet he continued his cleaning work. Every morning the restrooms on the 5th floor, every afternoon the corridors on the 10th, every evening the main lobby. It was a ritual that connected him to a tangible reality, while around him the empire crumbled only to rise from its ashes. The new board of directors, urgently put in place by panicked shareholders, summoned him daily. He entered the meeting rooms in his bleach-stained shirt, took a seat between lawyers in Dior and accountants in Saint Laurent, and dispensed advice worth millions. He knew all the company's secrets, all the skeletons in the closet, all the escape routes the guilty would try to take. It was during one of these meetings that the news that changed everything reached him. James Thompson, Isabella's right-hand man, the one who had orchestrated Marie's accident, had been apprehended at JFK Airport as he was about to flee to Brazil. His suitcase contained documents that implicated 50 other accomplices. David received the news without flinching. He stood up, declared that he had to finish cleaning the 15th floor, and left the room. He was found an hour later in the men's restroom, kneeling before a toilet bowl, crying as he hadn't cried, not even at Marie's funeral. They were not tears of joy, but of relief. 3 years of waiting were over. Emily arrived from Boston the next day. Her grandmother could no longer take care of her, being too old and ill. David rented a 3-room apartment 2 blocks from the tower in the East Village neighborhood. Nothing ostentatious, an ordinary dwelling for an ordinary family. In the morning he dropped Emily off at school, then left to clean offices worth billions. In the evening he helped her with her homework. They dined on buttered pasta, and he read her stories in French, English, and Russian, the languages he had practiced in embassies around the world. The little girl didn't understand why all her classmates suddenly wanted to be her friends at school. She didn't know that her father had become a legend, the man who had accomplished what neither magistrates nor journalists had managed in 20 years. For her, Dad was still the man who made her laugh with his animal imitations, and who always smelled a little like bleach. One evening, as he was cleaning Isabella's former office, now converted into an archive room, David noticed an anomaly. A plank of the oak floor was slightly loose. Using the knife he always carried on his belt, he lifted the plank. Beneath it was a metal box with an electronic lock. The code was obvious to anyone who knew Isabella. It was the date of Montmorency's IPO, her greatest triumph. In the box, David discovered something unexpected. There was a handwritten letter on personal letterhead. It was dated the day of the gala, likely written while he was changing at the Waldorf Astoria. Isabella had guessed who he was long before the Russian ambassador revealed it. She had understood when she saw him in the tuxedo, the way he wore the garment, his demeanor. In this letter she confessed everything, but that wasn't what disturbed David. It was the tone. There was neither arrogance nor defiance, but a curious admiration. Isabella admitted to having been defeated by a superior opponent, not in power or wealth, but in patience and determination. She conceded that the janitor had won because he knew how to wait, observe, and strike at the opportune moment. The letter was accompanied by the keys to safety deposit boxes in Swiss banks. They did not contain money. Everything had been seized, but they held something much more precious: patents, drug formulas that Isabella had concealed because they were deemed unprofitable, treatments for rare diseases affecting a few thousand people worldwide, remedies whose production was not economically viable but which would save lives. There was also a hard drive. Inside were terabytes of research that Marie had hacked before her death, but also original studies she had conducted. David's wife was not only a journalist but also a brilliant biochemist who had understood things that Montmorency researchers had ignored for years. David spent the night reading her documents. At dawn, when Emily woke up for school, she found him still at the desk, surrounded by papers, his eyes red, but sporting a smile she hadn't seen in 3 years. 2 years later, from the prison where she was serving her sentence, Isabella was granted a temporary release. She went to the building that had been her tower, now transformed into the Marie Sterling Foundation, named after David's wife. She had changed. Her hair was no longer dyed, her face was devoid of makeup, and she wore simple clothes. She seemed to have found in prison what power had never brought her: a conscience. She had with her a USB drive containing the names of all the international accomplices, the final piece of the puzzle to complete the big cleanup. When Emily met her, instead of the hatred everyone anticipated, she showed the supernatural wisdom of children who have suffered. She extended her hand to the woman who had ordered her mother's death and simply said that everyone deserved a second chance. 5 years after that gala evening, New York was inaugurating the Marie Sterling Research Center. David cut the inaugural ribbon with Emily, now a teenager, by his side. In the audience, in the back row, Isabella watched silently. She had served her sentence and was now working as a volunteer at a clinic in the Bronx. David's speech was brief but impactful. He spoke of the necessity of appearing weak to conquer strength, of patience as the most formidable weapon, and of the fact that true revenge is not destroying your enemy, but transforming them into something better. That evening, in the modest apartment he still refused to leave, David looked at the photos on the wall: Marie smiling, newborn Emily, and curiously a photo from the gala. Not out of nostalgia, but to remember that night, a janitor had accepted an invitation that changed everything. The center now saves thousands of lives. At its entrance, a plaque bears a single sentence: "Sometimes you have to pretend to clean the floors to clean the world." David still keeps a broom in his office. He no longer uses it, but it is there. A reminder that true power does not lie in what one shows, but in what one conceals. And that sometimes justice comes in the guise of a janitor, a mop in hand and vengeance in his heart. If this story captivated you to the very last word, if you felt the thrill of revelation upon discovering David's true identity, leave a like to support stories where nothing is as it seems. Comment with the moment that struck you the most. Share with those who need to believe that justice always arrives, even if it has to wait 3 years hidden behind a mop. Subscribe to the channel to discover other stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Remember, true power is knowing how to wait for the opportune moment. And sometimes the strongest are those who seem the weakest. What secret does the person you pass every day, but never notice, hide? Write it in the comments.